That will be as much as I will dare to say in Italian, I'm afraid. I will be giving my paper in English. I'm sorry not to be able to give it in Italian. I grew up in a Jewish Italian neighborhood in the suburbs of Cleveland, but unfortunately nothing really sank in, and I should have been paying attention better to the Italian that I heard somewhat around me, although it was more second and third generation Italian. I want to talk today about men, women, and gender in migration, and also thinking about and relating it to the refugee situation, the questions about refugees, which I think we're all very much attuned to today. But first, I do want to say some general things about how we do history. And clearly, as historians, we seek things and we find them. And I think it's important that we do it in that order. Because what is key, really, are the questions that we ask. The questions lead us into the archives, the questions help us read the archives, and over time, new questions keep cropping up, pushing historiography in different directions. So in two of the fields with which I am most involved and which most preoccupy me here, migration and gender, new questions over the last 40 years at least, from labor history to immigration history to mobility studies, then from women's history to gender history and gender studies. They've all brought new knowledge, and it's because of the questions that we ask. Now, I strongly believe in and plead for the complementarity of historiographic approaches rather than their competition. We accumulate knowledge by asking new questions. They do not necessarily invalidate completely previous knowledge, but I would argue add to it. Now, new questions lead to new answers, new nuances, and fresh ways of looking at things. So if we look at the field of migration and think about some of the historiographic changes over the last several decades, the last maybe 4 decades, they've amply raised new questions about human mobility. And the different points of view and the ways of studying migration are, of course, multiple. Migration history, like women's history, raised questions about the homogeneity of class. Historiographically speaking, class was once studied very much in depth. Class, however, seems to have given way to ethnicity, just as social history gave way to cultural history. Emphases on the structural constraints of migration, on studies about capitalism, about what we talked about as center and periphery, gave way to post-structural inquiry about individual agency and the strategies of mobility. Indeed, immigration and its attendant debates about assimilation and/or ethnicity, as seen from the countries of settlement, the two that I work on most, the United States and France, focused very much on a perspective of immigration and on what happens when people arrive. This was the subject of historical study from that perspective, that of immigration. Of course, I know it's been very different for Italy, first and for a long time a country of emigration before becoming a country of immigration. But for the classic countries of immigration, most of the research of the last 4 decades has been very much centered on the perspective of arrival. And yet, in the last 10, 15, 20 years, there has been more interest in emigration in the regions of departure, and of course the new terminology now, which has been quite often invoked, which is that of transnationalism and mobility as categories of individual connectedness and crossing of boundaries are increasingly emphasized in current research. So there's been a shift in migration studies from assimilation to ethnicity to transnationalism as questions of research. At the same time, as I'm sure you all know as well, women's history has shifted from looking primarily at women to gender studies and looking at more complex perspectives that have also been brought to migration studies. One of the first questions that women's history brought to migration studies was simply, where are the women? The category immigrant had been constructed as a young single male moving to either farm or a factory to find work and to escape the tyranny of poverty or of tradition. Although we quickly learned that it is not just the poorest people who move, one needs some means in order to do so. It remains true today. The first step to women's history, in any case, with regard to migration studies, was thus simply finding them, finding women within the migration streams. Female immigrants had in fact been there all along in varying numbers, but we had not looked for them. And here it was very clear that it was the process of asking and seeking that allowed us to find them. Once found, women immigrants have been subjected, perhaps more so than men, to different epistemological approaches that have given rise to different interpretations. On the one hand, there is, or has been, there was the more structural emphasis on a sort of triple oppression of women immigrants. That is, as foreigners, as poor, as women. On the other hand, there has been a more post-structural emphasis on agency, the ruses, the strategies, and the proactive activities through which female, like male immigrants, organize their lives, around or in spite of various structural constraints. As a general epistemological matter, the plaints of oppression, the difficulties of oppression, and the emphasis on victimhood have given way to a more, perhaps, cheerful view of subjecthood and the ways in which individuals can respond. At the same time, gender studies have well pointed out how male and female roles are constructed, and once we look for the social construction of gender in migration, in the migration experience, we find it too. So what I'd like to do today is to re-examine the intersection of immigration, migration, mobility, and women's gender and gender history, while at the same time asking another question, one that is the focus of this conference. Not only what difference does it make whether one is male or female in the migration experience, but also what difference does it make if one is a refugee or an exile? And obviously the questions of terminology are quite important. The migration crisis, as it's been called, of the past 2 years, has raised numerous questions for historians. As we see the terrible drama and deaths that unfold before our eyes, how does it make us re-question certain assumptions about the past? Or simply take us back to our sources to rethink and think about crises past, about refugees and migrants in the past, about mobility, planned or less planned or unplanned, about uprootings of all sorts, and how they affect men, how they affect women, and how they affect them differently and similarly. Migration studies is a complex field, and which combines both geography and history. It raises questions about states and individuals, the economy, politics, and culture, and each of these have been formally aspects of study within migration studies, those emphasizing more the economy, the economics, those emphasizing questions of citizenship and the politics of entry and settlement, and of course the cultural questions and today religious questions, which seem to loom so large as the only way of understanding migration when we know that there is a lot to be said still about the economics and the politics of movement. As a result of these different perspectives and different possible ways of studying mobility and migration, the field, as you well know, is also very interdisciplinary, so that we as historians don't have the only take on the matter. Migration studies have, however, often been separate from exile studies or refugee studies. And yet we know, and I think this is important and something I'm sure will be discussed over the next few days, is that the distinction between the categories migrant and refugee are tenuous and difficult sometimes to distinguish for various reasons. Perhaps not the least being that the current definition of refugee dates only to 1951. It was constructed in Geneva during the Cold War and obviously has a very important impact up until today. It was also conceptualized as sort of a male universal, the category of refugee that was defined at the time. But as historians, we know that refugees have existed before. And that the reality of the word existed long before as well. But more importantly, with regard to the terms refugee and migrant, insofar as the two terms are used to distinguish the political from the economic, we know that historically it is difficult to separate the two, and this for two reasons. On the one hand, emigrating even putatively to find work or as an economic issue is also a way of voting with one's feet against a regime that can no longer provide the necessary resources. But furthermore, the status and the experience of the mobility change over time. The trauma of flight, which remains embedded in the story of the refugee, is never effaced entirely. But it is ultimately transformed into the drama or the demands of settlement, so that political refugees become immigrant workers in a way, while the experience of exile itself is inherent in any border crossing, whether defined as political or economic. Literary exiles have expressed it perhaps with the most eloquence, but all border crossers feel the disruption of loss, the incomprehension, or the disruption of loss, the disruption of incomprehension, or simply of change. So I'd like to organize my remarks in the following way, raising more questions than I can answer, in order to stimulate all of us to think about the gender dimensions of migration and refugee status. I'll use gender in perhaps 3 ways: to ask about the similarities and differences experienced by men and women in migration, to look at the ways in which their roles or the reflections of masculinity and femininity have been socially constructed, and how the differentiation of those roles have been inscribed in the experiences. But also the relationship between men and women, families, and how migration both causes and is affected by gender. First of all, we need to examine the sex ratios, so I will spend a bit of time talking about numbers, because numbers, in a way, and the sex ratios, as I'll explain, actually are very revealing of gendered difference. Secondly, we can ask about what difference gender makes in the causes of migration, in what cases or in what respect are gender relations causes of migration or other forms of flight. Thirdly, we can think about what happens en route, and of course it is the visions of people moving, which over the last couple of years have been so visible before us, but we can ask about the gender differences of that movement and that period in between leaving and arriving someplace. And finally then ask about how settlement affects gender, or in a way, how does migration affect gender relations? So on the one hand, how does gender affect migration, and how does migration affect gender? All along the way, we can also question then the gender differences in situations of more or less organized or spontaneous migration, or moments of flight which are less organized and less planned. Sort of again this migrant-refugee distinction, which isn't always absolutely definable, but which is sometimes useful for asking about different forms of movement. So who migrates? Who flees? Who goes first? These are questions which, in a way, the sex ratios that we have in some of the statistics can help us understand. Who stays behind? The numbers are interesting, although, again, sex ratios in and of themselves are not just static demographic statistics. They need to be used to point to the gendered composition of mobility. Within any given cohort, the numbers do not just reflect the demographic base of the place of origin, in which case men and women would move in roughly similar proportions. On the contrary, the numbers of men and women who have left one country for another are a first indication of the ways in which migration is not gender neutral. Classically, women have been seen to be the last to go. Even today, in a time of great crisis and mobility, even with women and children sometimes highlighted in the photos that we see and in the most dramatic photos of displacement, many more photos seem to show the long lines of men trudging along the train tracks, packed in overloaded boats, or living in the shanty towns along the way. An estimated 3/4 of the migrants or the refugees today are men. This does not mean that women don't follow, but it raises a long-time historic question for us as historians. What does this mean about the urgency of departure as migrants or as refugees? What about the interval? When are decisions made and under what terms? And what about the interval? the period between migrations, if we look at families, the migration of the husbands, migration of wives, when families are separated. The period of family rupture may mean long waits of months, if not years, and then has an effect on the gender relations. Statistics upon arrival, which are much easier to count, as you probably all know, than statistics of departure. So we do know a lot more, or can sort of describe immigration more easily than emigration. Statistics upon arrival are a good indication of solo or family migration. Historically, the more women, the greater number of families, or this is how the statistics have often been interpreted. That is, this has an impact on settlement, although this has also been interpreted in contradictory ways. Do more women and more families mean more community insularity and resistance to assimilation? Or do more women and more families mean more stability and ultimate integration? This latter point was even the viewpoint of the xenophobic, selectively xenophobic demographer, Georges Mocot, in his classic 1932 study of foreigners in France, where he argued that women and families were good for immigration purposes because they did help stabilize the immigration flows, meaning, of course, that they calmed the guys down, and this made the whole situation better than it might be with just kind of raving single young men. At least that's how I understood it. But the higher presence of women may also mean different things. It may mean an elite migration among the Americans in Paris that I studied as a sort of elite migration group. The higher percentage of women shows also a cohort of sort of saisonnières and salon socialites. On the contrary, however, higher percentages of women can also show high numbers of domestics, of female domestic workers. Irish women in the United States in the 19th century, for example, but also Luxembourg or German women in France in the 1930s, or, of course, one of the major images of today's migration flows, Filipino nurses and aid workers in the United States today. Sex ratios do not speak in and of themselves, but like most data, they need to be contextualized in each time period. And yet, in spite of the refugee crisis, and in spite of other forms of mobility, much has been made of late about the newness of feminization of migration. This in itself is a good example of the ways in which statistics need to be situated. For one thing, the assertion of contemporary feminization has minimized or even made invisible large numbers of women moving in the past, but which we as historians can easily show. Even in the 19th century, perhaps 40% of a migration stream at times was made up of women, which is a not insignificant figure, even if not the majority. Catherine Donata and Donna Gabaccia have questioned the presentism of recent analyses and have shown about feminization, and have shown how women even made up a sizable percentage of migrants in, if one wants to call them migrants, forced migrants, in the early period of slavery, for example, to the United States. In the United States, women came to make up a majority of immigrants as of the 1930s. But there are two corollaries to this fact that are noteworthy and further contextualize any notion of the newness of the feminization of migration flows. One is that this historic figure or fact of 1930s feminization of migration flows to the United States was not discovered, so to speak, until the 1980s. Why the delay? Well, it was not until really the 1970s and 1980s that historians started to look and to ask, where are the women? And then found that they had been there, actually, for already half a century. To the collective surprise, perhaps, we found that women had been there all along, in spite of the image of the male immigrant factory or mine worker. The difference then between history and historiography in itself abets difference in findings and interpretations. In the case of France, history and historiography were happened more simultaneously, with the discovery of the feminization of immigration flows to France in the 1970s, at the same time that historiography and interest in women's history, of course, was on the rise. Second, one of the problems of the often journalistic approach to the feminization literature of today is that it focuses on one particular and particularly dramatic form of female migration, that of trafficking and the horrors of the prostitution pathway of mobility. Migration and prostitution has a long history, but it should not mask other long-term forms of female migration. The sex ratios of statistics have another purpose, though. And I invite you all to think about the numbers of men and women in your studies in this respect. They can be our entry into questions about the construction of gendered migration flows. If the statistical sex ratios show that men and women migrate in different proportions at different times, how do they also make us think about the reasons for those different percentages and how they are largely gendered, constructed, and how and by whom? And I would argue that this is largely due to two actors, one could call them, the state and the labor market. But also, in times of crisis, due to gendered understandings, often of the danger of flight. So just a few words on state policy and labor recruitment. The feminization, so-called feminization of immigration, is not simply the result of increased trafficking in prostitution or the recent explosion of the care industry. It can be a secondary effect of state policies. The relative closing of entrance to the United States in the 1920s due to the quota laws of 1921 and 1924, like the suspension of labor migration in France in the mid-1970s, both affected the gendered makeup of subsequent immigration flows by limiting the arrival of workers, defined largely as male workers, while allowing family reunification, meaning the entrance of women. The so-called closure policies, in fact, resulted in an increase in the percentage of women arriving subsequently. When the United States Bracero program, for example, recruited guest workers from Mexico from 1942 to 1964, it recruited men only and made family reunification very difficult. When French recruiters went to North Africa in the 1950s, they sought male workers for their plants. And the workers' housing that they built was, in France, were for single men only. Sex ratios can help us understand the gendered rationales behind state policy and labor recruitment as they reflect long-term shifts in the political economy of the countries of immigration. If immigrants were first conceptualized as male factory workers, recognizing that women too have been immigrant workers has fundamentally shifted the very image of immigrants and immigrant work. The female care worker as a category today speaks to the gendered construction of labor markets as much as to the migration flows themselves. Yet foreign-born women also have a long history of factory work, notably in the textile factories, also in the garment industry. The migration streams in and of themselves reflect larger shifts in work patterns in both countries. 19th century male migrants moved towards male-defined jobs that were constructed as male jobs, such as in mining, heavy industry, or agricultural work, while late 20th century female immigrants help us understand not just the feminization of migration, but the service sectorization of the West's economies as well. The sex ratios of refugees, if we want to use a distinct category, is also revealing. The construction of the representation of flight may be gendered in contradictory ways. And these are questions which we can re-ask, I think, our historical sources. Today's images of masses of men are interspersed with, as I mentioned, poignant pictures, such as that of the 3-year-old Syrian Elan. Other photos of women and families are also often presented up front, families, women with children in their arms. They may be compared, perhaps, to other period pictures of mass flight or compact lines of migrants and refugees, whether at Ellis Island at the turn of the 20th century or of Spanish refugees to France in 1939. This leads to a series of questions about the present and the past. It takes tremendous courage to decide to leave, whether alone or as a family, whether planned or relatively unplanned. Even if the crisis is immediate, not everyone leaves at the same time. Yet the known and unknown dangers of the route itself, the necessity of obtaining working or residence permits abroad may be a gendered constraint, with men being considered the preferred initial envoys in order to be able to bring the family over later. To what extent are we still seeing a sort of classic gendered migration strategy, even among the desperate refugees? But how do these demographic imbalances of mobility have an impact from the point of departure to the route itself to the points of settlement? Sex ratios thus enumerate the numbers of men and women on the move. At the same time, they reflect state and labor policies and conditions of departure, and they lead to questions about the gendered implications of immigration and flight and the shifting categories of difference in migration and labor patterns. Sex ratios may also be used to reflect and understand different types of mobility. Higher percentages of women may be interpreted as a sign of family reunification and of greater community stability, or they may be interpreted as proof of changing labor markets defined as female, domestic workers yesterday, care workers today. They may also be interpreted as signs of political or physical oppression. Whole families fleeing, and this is the way sometimes it is interpreted, that whole families fleeing together is proof of crisis, in contrast to image of the male migrant breadwinner leaving. But statistics in and of themselves are not naked, so to speak, are not in the absolute something that we can understand. And here I quote the economist Deirdre McCloskey. From the bare lone number, one can infer nothing because no standard is provided for saying whether the number is large or small. It is the construction of the numbers and their use which concerns us and which helps us understand some of these questions about gender difference. Secondly then, if we can look, so the sex ratios have an impact and can help us question gendered implications of mobility. But then the question becomes, I think, this kind of twofold question. One is, what is the extent to which gender causes migration? To what extent does migration affect gender relations? Gendered causes of migration or other forms of flight, and again, the types of mobility even that we're seeing today raise questions about the impact on how the choice is about for both men and women. If states and labor markets in the countries of destination have had a decisive impact on migration flows, men and women choose to move from their points of origin for a variety of reasons. Economic opportunity, to be sure, but gender relations may be a cause of migration or may accelerate or aggravate other reasons. I do not want to argue for only gender as an explanation or understanding of migration. What I really am trying to do is just to make sure that we think about this as another aspect of migration and of mobility of different sorts. Historically, there have been other forms of gendered migration, but one that has been actually the most explicit, perhaps, is what we have called matrimonial migration. This could be of two sorts: migrating to find a partner, migrating to leave one. In the first case, as Irish men moved to Britain to find work in the mid-19th century, Irish women crossed the Atlantic. They found ample work as domestics, creating which was one of the first feminized migration flows, that of single women. There were more Irish women who moved to the United States in the 19th century than Irish men. In the case of the Irish, economic opportunity was also underwritten by demographic imbalance at home. But I am reminded of a story that was told at a conference by someone who was studying Finnish migration to Canada, in which she found some letters, and this was a question of how you can use letters as a source in migration history. And she found two letters from a Finnish woman young woman who had moved to Canada, and she wrote one letter home to her boyfriend saying, well, life is really difficult here after all, and maybe you shouldn't come just yet. In another letter, she wrote to her girlfriend, and she said, come right away, there are lots of men here. Migration for various reasons then, but in the case of the single women, the single Irish women moving to the United States, again, it's been clearly correlated to demographic imbalance in Ireland, of course, and the potato famine, as we know, which was a major motivation for migration all the way around. In the case of Jewish immigration from the Russian Empire in the early 20th century, we have proof of the opposite, a dematrimonialization, if you will. Some Jewish men apparently left not just to escape anti-Semitism and to look for work, but in order to leave spouses behind, or in any case, de facto leaving them behind, sometimes for good. And we know this because the daily Yiddish newspaper in New York, the Forward, published a weekly Gallery of Missing Husbands, a column. And at the same time, a National Desertion Bureau was set up in 1911 in order to locate missing Jewish husbands. Both attest to this other gendered aspect of the migration stream, although it may be difficult to know whether the change of heart occurred before or after migration, whether in fact split-ups were cause or effect. Other forms of matrimonial migration have been studied, such as picture brides, war brides, due to various things, love perhaps, strategy perhaps, hormones perhaps. What is the economic structure of marriage? Men needing wives for aid in reproduction, in production and reproduction, to settle farms, to create and take care of home and progeny in a new land. Women wanting husbands in order to leave one home, the paternal home, for another, but also hoping for economic security. Matrimonial emigration could be a form of anticipated emancipation, ultimately successful or not. But the reasons are as many as the examples. Japanese women contracting to come to the United States as picture brides. French women moving to the United States with their soldier husbands after World War I, and in all cases with varying results. Patterns of mobility in periods of relative peace or in periods of war may have their own gendered causes. That men have often migrated before women to establish an economic beachhead before the family follows is well known. But there are other times when women and children have been sent ahead as scouts to settle in and to secure a better education perhaps for the children while the male breadwinner stays where his work is. In periods of war or other armed dangers, gender too will have an impact on mobility. Women and children may be sent ahead to keep them away from physical harm. Or on the contrary, young men may make up the bulk of the forerunners due to the physically risky migration routes, much of which we're seeing today. Gender does not, in and of itself, necessarily cause migration, although flight from traditional norms of sexuality, increasingly visible today, surely have had their counterpart in the past. But more generally, gender relations at home and anticipation connected to gendered constructed roles may determine who migrates first. These may be social, familial, or individual decisions, but they all may be overdetermined by the constructed nature of gender expectations even before anyone takes the first step to leave. In times of war, fear of rape at home may motivate the sending of women abroad or heighten family migration as a unit. But fear of dangers for women en route may have the opposite effect, leaving them at home until they can join their husbands under better conditions of travel. I'd like to turn then more briefly to this period of in-betweenness, the route itself. This is where geography and the logistics that were mentioned before have a great impact. But I must say that the current situation in the last couple of years has raised questions which I think need more historical research. Was rape or the first exchange of sexual favors for protection, in quotation marks, as much a part of the story in the past as they are today? And it's certainly in the literature on the gender of refugees. Or is it that we are only talking about it now? The time and space of travel from one place to another, the lieux de passage, as I've called them in French, or the territoire de l'attente, as other colleagues have called it, may themselves be fraught with gender differences. From the banal question of who carries the kids and the pillows and everything else one might want to take with, to the horrific tales of forced prostitution and rape that accompany the current migration crisis, just as they have past refugee situations. A historical topic still needing more attention. The route can be dangerous in and of itself, and as current research on refugees and gender has pointed out, men and women may be targeted differently. Men may be physically assaulted, women sexually assaulted. Furthermore, to the extent that women's bodies are seen as representing the honor of the group, and that the routes are not always linear and may entail waiting periods of days or months before arriving at a final destination, there may be different implications for men and women. There are different groups, one could say, who also help construct the gendered aspects of migration along the way. I would say two that we can point to and who have clearly historical roles that have been studied and perhaps need more study. One have to do with the migration agents. They were already excoriated. Today we talk about traffickers. Migration agents in the 19th century were already criticized, like the traffickers of today. They were at the core of this, or at the intersection of this question of the geography of movement and of the logistics involved. Like the traffickers today, the agents of migration in the 19th century were helping, in quotation marks, people on the road, arranging transportation, helping lodge people, but clearly with profit involved, clearly with sometimes vermin or danger-filled hotels en route. A good research question has to be, how do those in charge of the infrastructure, then and now, imagine their charges? To what extent did they see them as single men, or imagining that most of the flows would be single men? To what extent do they imagine or understand and then organize accordingly flows that have to do more with families? And how do they take care of, the term is obviously too neutral to be useful, single women? These differences and the ways in which the route itself has been constructed, we can see in various ways, one of which is the ways in which organizations were created in order to help single women en route, that is, with the understanding that they were at greater danger than others. Church groups then and now set up safe houses to protect the vulnerable, women and children. A sign in and of itself that those migrating alone were seen as needing help from otherwise unscrupulous or dangerous intermediaries. Should I? That's okay, I will try and come to my fourth point and then conclude. Just to remember though, migration agents, I think in and of themselves, are important to reanalyze and to compare both 19th, 20th, and 21st century. The others are emigration and immigration authorities, who themselves en route also were part of the construction of the gendered nature of mobility. That is, how have states, how have immigration officials perceived those who are migrating, how they have organized that migration. We know in the 19th century how US officials particularly were on the lookout for prostitutes. Therefore, single women migrating were always seen as much more suspect than single men migrating. Homosexuality was also a concern, and the picture of the perfect little migrant family, which is the iconic image of Ellis Island, where you have two parents and a child, is very much speaks to the fact of what the immigration imaginary of the officials were in terms of a heterosexual family arriving, which was not often the case of the ways in which people actually moved. Finally, then, let me ask my last question, which has to do with not just the causes of migration, the routes of migration, but also the effects of migration. What happens after arrival? Are previous gendered relations reproduced or destabilized? Are they exacerbated? Can they be lessened? And under what conditions does migration reinforce or exacerbate initial gender roles or force their reevaluation? The literature on the feminization of migration flows today often emphasizes the ways in which the contemporary female migration of care workers in particular overturned traditional gender roles at home. With men left behind to care for children, grandmothers help as well, and women sending back the needed remittances to do so, historically, in a way, it's being presented that gendered migration patterns seem to have been turned on their head. The classic 19th century model of the male breadwinner crossing the ocean and sending back money before sending for the family seems to have been replaced by a new model, that of a female breadwinner doing the same. However, the emotional costs of separation from spouse and especially children are considered to be greater for women than for men. The historian's questions are thus multiple. Certainly more work needs to be done on the period of separation. We can re-look at letters to talk about this and to look at the emotional involvement. We've often used letters to understand the mechanics of migration and some of the migration pathways, but I think we can look at them again for this period to study the period of separation when families are separated. If beyond separation is settlement, how does migration affect gender patterns? How does it affect sexuality? or dating patterns. Does immigration mean emancipation? This was a question that has been asked for women's history in particular. It's a question that can be asked for male migrants as well. Does displacement make things better or worse? The debate over emancipation for women in migration continues and could be explored for men as well. Here too, I think we oscillate between versions that are optimistic and pessimistic as to the results of settlement in a new place. For migrants, the move over space collapses, the change over time. Changes are occurring both in the places of origin and in the place of settlement with regard to the manners, the ways in which couples form, the way in which sexuality occurs, heterosexual as homosexual. But we know, for example, that in the New World, chaperones, the famous chaperones of the Old World, soon disappeared. There are ways in which dating occurred that were transformed as a result of migration. The sense of some freedom in terms of personal autonomy clearly had an impact on everything, including sexuality, for women and men as well after migration. Finally, does the reestablishment or reordering of gender relations at the point of arrival occur with more or less difficulty if the move was precipitated by flight in a more of a refugee manner, or by a more, and again these are relative terms, a more thought out migration. Migration, like war, may slow or accelerate changing gender roles, but I think these are questions that we need to look at more closely, case by case. Moving from one country and one set of expectations to another is never anodyne, whether the circumstances are ones of choice, ones of flight, or a combination of the two. Let me conclude with some last remarks about this question of how we look at the sources and how we interpret them. Structures versus agency, pessimism versus optimism. We can conclude by returning to some of these epistemological questions concerning migration in general and gendered mobility more specifically. The questions we ask are determinate, and the ways in which we find answers, I think, are also testimony to the moments in which we do ask those questions. The early discovery, in quotation marks, of immigrant women often emphasized, as I mentioned, their triple disability. However, the historiographic image of victimization has been overturned with a much more upbeat interpretation emphasizing agency of women, like the agency of men, in their patterns of mobility. Historians have followed epistemological trends in emphasizing one or the other, and I would just want to conclude by saying that I think that both are important. Both the constraint and agency are historically present. It is true for women as it is for men. It is true for refugees. Again, these two categories, which are not all that distinct when we start to look at them more closely. It is true for refugees, it is for migrants. We're essentializing either men or women, but without essentializing either men or women. What is important are the questions about how the constructed nature of the gendered identities occur and how they are affected by mobility. I'm simply asking that no matter what our specific time periods or geographic areas of study, that we think about how mobility may be gendered, how it is structured by gendered politics, gendered economics, gendered labor markets, different forms of culture, and how individuals, men and women, make their choices within varying sets of expectations, but also constraints. Thank you.
C'è qualche domanda? Is there any questions? Se non ci sono osservazioni possiamo rimandare eventualmente alla fine degli interventi più tardi. E allora adesso chiamiamo a parlare Maurizio Isabella. Un attimo solo.